Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters.
So we start today's podcast with a tribute to a name that many in the industry will be synonymous and aware of. And there is an article in the Car Dealer that tributes pour in after used car dealer Dan Kirby tragically dies at the age of 37. Now, Dan Kirby was the founder of Trade Price Cars, who has passed away. He was much loved. Said to have struggled over this time with mental health, and he is very well known across the sector. And there is a picture of him with his team on stage winning awards down at the Car Dealer Award event. So we just wanted to start off with a tribute and a shout out to Dan Kirby, who was sadly passed away at the age of 37 this week.
Yeah, very, very sad news. And there's a nice tribute within the Car Dealer story from Car Key's Jamie Capel, who says, Dan was a very talented and driven individual, motor trader, racing driver, and former multiple-time award winner at the Car Dealer Used Car Awards. He was held in such high regard by those who ever had the pleasure of dealing with him. And you only need to look at the comments and tributes made to him across social media to see how much he meant to so many people. So very sad news there.
It is. So on to the show, because I think it's a case of strap yourselves in, get yourself a coffee, a cup of tea, glass of water, or even a wine, a whiskey or a beer, depending what time you're listening to this, because it's without doubt been a little bit of a busy week this week in the automotive sector. I think midweek this week, things changed a little bit.
It did, yeah. There's that old saying, isn't there, from Harold Wilson about a week being a long time in politics. Well, that applied to the motor trade this week, and indeed most weeks, because so much happened, so much changed in the last 7 days, and so much so that this week we're just going to concentrate on the two big stories, aren't we?
We are, which we'll get into shortly. So first shout out is, if you haven't listened to the Steve Young ICDP interview earlier on this week that we shared, it'll be on your podcast feed, but we interview Steve Young right after the announcement of one of this week's stories, which is about the Lithia's takeover of Pendragon, and we have got an extract from the interview there with Steve when we start to talk about what's been happening with Lithia Pendragon this week. So do when you've listened to today, do have a listen back, because it's a very insightful and very informative conversation there with Steve Young from ICDP.
Yeah, definitely. We caught up with Steve as that story was breaking, so it was just fascinating to have his input, his take on the ramifications. So also this week at the end of this show, we'll have a Menable moment with Stephen Whitton, friend of the pod, and with Stephen looking at some mental well-being issues, best practices, and some observations on what's been a busy week for him as well.
Exactly. And the other week we'd mentioned the forthcoming awards, and the first one, Motor Trader. So they've actually extended its awards deadline to Friday the 29th of September. Gives you a little bit more time to get your nominations and submissions into that. So if you do head over to the Motor Trader website to check out the categories and the online entry form there. So that's now been extended till Friday the 29th of September.
There will be a lot of relieved listeners. Yes. So yeah, some extra time there. So make the most of it. And also entries are still open for Car Dealer's Used Car Dealer Awards. So entries across 23 categories, and they actually close on 1st of October. And again, the process is all online, so head over to the car dealer website and get nominating now. So the awards night for that is in London on the 27th of November.
Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group.
So, as we said, headlines this week, only 2 stories, but what we'll do is we'll pull various sources, various stories from AM, Auto Retail Agenda, Car Dealer, The Mail, and the FT, and probably a couple of others. So we have a show very much of 2 halves this week, with the first half looking at the 2030 ICE ban being bumped back to 2035. You may have heard of that story, Phil, during the week.
Yeah, I think I bet a bit of coverage this week on that one. Yeah, just a bit.
And the second half of today's pod, we'll take a closer look at Lithia's announcement that it's buying Pendragon for £280 million, Pinewood becoming a standalone listed DMS business, and Lithia and Penske's joint counteroffer.
So as Curtis has said there, a podcast of 2 halves, and the first one, let's say, we're going to talk about some of the headlines, the stories, and impact of the announcement this week. And I mean, we're talking about announcements. We've had inflation this week that softened, but certainly not on its way down to where it should be going into the 4th quarter of this year. Bank of England have now held the base rate, but I've warned that there could be another base rate increase before the end of the year. But with the reduction or the softening of the inflation, they have held the base rate. But that was kind of muted with everything else going on, wasn't it, Curtis? I mean, that would have been a story that people would have been following this week. But as Curtis said there, the first one we're going to talk about is in AM, and the headline is Industry Rocked by UK Pushing Back 2030 Ban on New Petrol and Diesel Cars. Now, we mentioned a while ago on the podcast when the by-election happened and suddenly there was conversations coming out of UK government about the motorist, and Rishi was then talking about, he's this friend of the supporter of the motorist and things like this. And then it kind of broke, and the question was asked, was they going to do anything to the 2030 deadline? And it was an adamant no, it remains. That's changed this week because it's now moved, hasn't it, Curtis, out to 2035.
Yeah, indeed. You know what, Phil? I'm going to take a pragmatic and proportionate stance on this story. Is it a surprise? It's not really, because there's been a lot of talk about how realistic the 2030 ban was. And let's not forget, originally the ban was set at 2035, but a certain Boris Johnson brought it forward because he didn't believe it was bold enough. So 2030 was certainly bold. Whether or not it was ever practical, well, I mean, clearly, achievable. Clearly not, because the government has looked at this. That they've looked at the road to 2030. They've looked at the results of the Uxbridge by-election and filtered this all in, and it has been knocked back to 2035, which is the same date that was set by the EU. And I guess one of the outcomes of this is that we've finally got clarity, but again, have we? Because there could be a general election. Well, there will be a general election next year. There could be a different government in place, and if it's not a Conservative government, will the 2030 ban be revived? We just don't know.
No, and this is the whole thing at the minute, isn't it? I mean, the commentators, whether is it the right decision? As you say, Curtis, it's probably the right decision that we align with Europe as it was initially set with Europe. The question with this one is, how much has this been done at a time of a potential election next year? is probably what is driving much of the conversation and debate around all of this, isn't it? That there has been a significant amount of investment, R&D, put into the transition to electrification. Some of that probably won't change. I mean, the trajectory of direction probably remains exactly the same as it did the day before the announcement, but it just creates this uncertainty, moving goalposts, lack of confidence from maybe people looking at the UK. But I think me and you were talking before the show that there's some very interesting and very pragmatic comments from many industry commentators on this, aren't there, been so far?
Yeah, definitely. And the AM story is worth checking out because as we record this, this is probably the best story that gathers together industry comments. So there's comments from the likes of Ian Plummer, from Auto Trade, Sally Foote from Carwow, your good self, Phil, you're included in this story, and as well as Dylan Setterfield from CAP HPI. And Dylan actually makes some interesting comments because it goes back to that's did the industry truly believe in the ban actually coming into force in 2030, or would there be some wriggle room? So he's kind of shed some light on what the CAP HBI thinking was, because the assumption there was that someone at some stage was going to move it back to 2035. But Dylan says that was kind of expected after the next general election, not before. So he says our assumption had been that the ICE ban would be extended to 2035 by the next government, regardless of which party or parties would be in power, with the new incumbents blaming the current administration for not making sufficient progress to meet the 2030 target. So, it is interesting that we're starting to see some of those comments coming out now.
Yeah, and it's always, when even before these announcements, people say, is it realistic that the 2030 ban is right? Is it too early? Should we be aligned with the EU? And a lot of the answers are, there's potential for 2 more governments before 2030, so anything can happen. It can be pushed back. And that was always a standard conversation across the sector, that it was always, well, you know what, anything could happen. It could get pushed back. They could introduce e-fuels. They could soften it. We don't know. But, you have a potential of another 2 governments before the 2030 deadline. So it's always going to be one of them, watch and see. But when you do look at the market, and there's 2 things, and the first one is that the UK, in perspective, that we do register less than 3% of the global production when it comes to car registrations of global production. So, we are a significant player in terms of size. We are a significant player, particularly compared to the European market. When it comes to, I think we're second normally behind Germany. We have lost that position a couple of times over the years, but there's a whole bigger market out there for the OEMs that they're trying to manage and navigate with. So, the UK is it's a reasonable market for the OEMs, but again, we are less than 3% of global production of what these manufacturers pump out in terms of product.
Yeah, and we're now in a position to know what some of the manufacturers think about the change. So heading over to Car Dealer, the headline there is, manufacturers will not change plans despite petrol and diesel car ban being pushed back. So they've got various comments from some of the car manufacturers on what this will mean. So Mini, for example, told Car Dealer that it had already announced that it will become a purely electric brand from 2030 globally, and this will not change. Although I do wonder what BMW Group would have to say about this, because only last week on the pod we were talking about that mega investment into Cowley production, Cowley going over to purely EV manufacturing, and what this will mean to that investment. I haven't seen anything. I've been looking out for a comment from BMW Group, because they obviously made that commitment on the understanding that the UK was introducing the ban in 2030. Okay, it's producing cars for the UK and the rest of Europe, and it will change its production accordingly, but there will be ramifications there.
Yeah, and I think there's a comment here from Stellantis spokesperson that our range will progressively move towards 100% electric ahead of current legislations. For example, Fiat Alfa Romeo and DS becoming fully electric by 2027 and Vauxhall by 2028. And we also know that people like Volvo are accelerating very quickly to be 100% electric. And one of the other things that has been muted by some of the sector from an investment perspective is that the UK has attracted investment on the basis that they were transitioning by 2030.
Yeah.
And they were getting investment ahead of other markets because they were 5 years ahead. And that's come into question now, that how much money have they received on the assumption that they are moving 5 years ahead of other markets. So yeah, I mean, there's quite a balance between OEM's view of it, isn't it, on what's been coming out at the minute?
Yes, because the day before Rishi Sunak's announcement, we had Ford commenting on what was then speculation, because it was the BBC that broke the story. They got the head start on this one. They broke the story the day before, and Ford commented that what it wants in the UK is certainty. That sort of certainty to make investments, to make long-term plans, and moving from 2030 to 2035 would affect that. So that was quite interesting, because it was quite a detailed statement, as I say, before Rishi Sunak actually stood up. And since then, if we head over to the Mail's coverage, we've had sort of fairly detailed comments from Jaguar and Toyota, obviously two big manufacturers in the UK. Now, bearing in mind that the Mail has led a campaign on rethinking the 2030 petrol car ban. It's been running this campaign for a little while, so it actually quotes Jaguar Land Rover as saying the announcement by the government on the revised end date for the sale of petrol and diesel cars in the UK is pragmatic and brings the UK in line with other nations, which we welcome. And that's particularly interesting because, of course, Jaguar Land Rover's parent, Tata, has committed to this gigafactory in Somerset. So it looks as though the move gets the thumbs up from them.
Yeah, definitely. And the next bit on this one is over to the Financial Times, which we're now talking about EVs and where the car makers in the UK to face EV sales target despite delay to petrol vehicle ban. Now, this is talking about the ZEV mandate that comes into force next year, where the manufacturers need to achieve the 22% bracket or percentage share of their vehicles being battery electric, which is kind of hasn't that. I mean, that's been confirmed that is not changing. So the deadline from 2030 has been pushed back to 2035, but you still have these legislations and mandatory measures that remain in play.
Yeah, it seems a bit harsh now, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What's the big rush? But that is particularly significant because so you say, as you say, 22% by 2024. So of their total sales must be zero emission, and that ratchets up to 80% by 2030, which is effectively the old date now.
Yeah.
And there's some hefty fines, aren't there, for manufacturers that don't meet these targets, because they can be fined up to 15,000.
Yeah, as you say there, Curtis, I mean, they can be fined up to £15,000 per vehicle. So there's a lot of pressure on the manufacturers there to achieve these deadlines. And they say about modest tweaks to be made to the scheme, but an initial target requiring 22% for each car maker's sales in 2024. And you and I, Curtis, were chatting before the podcast that, I think it's going to be interesting now as we watch the performance of battery electric vehicles as we begin to sort of head towards the final part of the year. Because, will the mandate of the 22% that comes into force 2024 begin to have an influence on when the manufacturer's vehicles are registered? And, we have a potential where some of the OEMs will think that actually, defer those registrations now into the first quarter of 2024. Let's move the combustion engines into 2023. And because obviously there are these, those are significant fines that the manufacturers do face. And this is all going to get very interesting because, as I say, Curtis, you and I mentioned before the show that you could start to read the fall or the easing in EVs in terms of registrations as a result of the 2030 deferment to 2035, or actually it could be purely a consequence of the manufacturers trying to focus on the 22% mandate for 2024 and therefore ease back on their push on battery electric vehicles for 2023. So it's going to get very interesting when we start to see performance as we head towards the end of the year.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because this year in particular, we've kind of tracked that cooling off of retail demand. Very, very strong in the fleet sector, but a slight cooling off in retail. And I think you're absolutely right. We will start to see that dip even more now as manufacturers bundle their allocations for 23 into 24, because there's more of an incentive for them to sell them in 24 than 23. So in terms of unintended consequences, that's quite a big one.
Exactly. So, like I say, tale of two halves this week in terms of the podcast. There's a lot going on. There's a lot more announcements to come out from the UK government in terms of how they're going to achieve the 2050 target and how this all starts to play out. So we'll try and keep ahead of it and keep you informed as it develops.
You're listening to all the chatter that matters on Motor Trade Radio, powered by eBay Motors Group. This is your weekly one-stop shop for all the biggest car retailing headlines from across the media, available on demand wherever you are on your podcast feed.
So we'll start the second half of the show with an extract from our chat with ICDP's Steve Young, which we recorded earlier on this week, and it's still on your podcast feed there. And just after the announcement of Lithia's move to buy Pendragon for $280 million, and the spinning off of Pinewood into a standalone listed DMS company. What we are talking about is obviously with the news that broke Monday morning, depending on when you're listening to this podcast, that the US dealer group, Lithia Motors, 296 dealerships in the US, is acquiring or attempting to acquire Pendragon's motor and leasing business for the value of $250 million, which equates to 16.5 pence per share. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But this, of course, follows the Lithia's $300 million acquisition of Jardine Motors, 42 sites in March of this year, but it does exclude at this minute the Pinewood part of the business, which will be spun into a standalone listed business. I mean, as we say, it's not a done deal yet, and it's quite a complicated deal, and it obviously does require complete shareholders' approval. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more detail, Steve, because there's a certain shareholder that has an influence on this and in the name of Hedin. So, I mean, on the face of it, it is a complicated deal. But what's your take on this, on the back of what you were just saying there about obviously the tension and what's been going on in previous months?
Well, I think the split makes some sense. There's two issues, as I understand it from the outside, about Pendragon that makes it, a slightly challenging acquisition for someone. One relates to the retail business and some property leases that, as I understand it, become increasingly unattractive over time and would cost a chunk of money to renegotiate. But that's, to a certain extent, you could consider as business as usual. Everyone has to juggle with their property exposure to some extent. But then the other one was a legal case against Pinewood, and which is not yet settled, apparently due imminently, but we still haven't heard. But is a fairly daunting 300 million claim from a former Asian partner of Pinewood. So you could almost describe it as sort of a poison pill that sits within the Pinewood business. And then the other aspect of that is that Pinewood has always been constrained a little bit by its ownership by a dealer group. So whether that's Pendragon as it was or someone else who bought Pendragon, then there would always be some dealers who'd say, well, I'll never deal with Pinewood because of the ownership. So in that respect, splitting it makes some sense. And the surprising bit is really the value that's been put on the two elements. So effectively, as you said, 16.5 pence for the dealer business, and the value that Pendragon have put forward for the listed company, which will now become Pinewood, is another 10 pence, and then there's some bits related to a possible US joint venture that would give you 27. Now that's less than the deal that was on the table either from Hedin or Lithia in the course of last year. So it doesn't seem a very generous offer, but it might be an offer that can be done, whereas neither of the previous ones could be, delivered in the end, as we saw.
Well, some fascinating insight there from Steve Young, as ever. And this deal is particularly interesting, isn't it, Phil? Because we're talking about £250 million for Pendragon and an additional £30 million investment in the remaining Pinewood business. Now, Pinewood, for as long as I can remember, has always been the sort of jewel in the crown at Pendragon, but it hasn't been allowed to shine in a way that maybe it could have done. And I think Steve it hits the nail on the head there, because there are a number of dealer groups who just would not deal with Pinewood because of its ownership. They didn't want to be putting money into the pockets of another dealer. But as a standalone company, that becomes a really, really strong proposition, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, if you remember back when we were covering this story, back when they were initially approached, and it was Hedin and Lithia again that were going head to head, and there was that debate because I think Pinewood was initially in the deal. Then there was this rumor that Pinewood has been removed from the deal, which then was one of the reasons reported why they stepped away from the offer. Then it came to light that Pinewood was under some kind of potential court case from Asia that were again, because it had been announced, that then had to be, it was unclear as to the outcome of that. And that then complicated the deal. And now we're here today. And you look at the deal, and as you say, in its entirety, it looks complicated, but you understand why it was worked that way. So again, I mean, we know the Lookers deal's still going on. It's still not a done deal yet. I don't think that's gone through as yet. I think there's still stuff going on with the OEMs and the competition authority and things like that. So there's always a lot to play out in these kind of things. At the minute, but you know, one thing is clear with this. You know, Lithia, you know, they walked away, they went into the Jardines, they're now back again. So it kind of shows their appetite to buy a large group in the UK and expand their UK footprint, doesn't it?
Yeah, and this would make them, I mean, certainly the second or third largest group in the UK, and it is a massive opportunity for Lithia. And just returning briefly to how Pinewood would fit into this new world order. The Jardine operation in the UK covers 42 sites, and my understanding of the deal is that Pinewood would be open to them now, as well as Lithia's business in North America, as potential customers for Pinewood. So, in the round, the figures might be lower for this deal, but it's a very, very compelling deal for both parties.
It is, yeah.
And in terms of lots to play out, the next story is from AM Online, and it's Pendragon rejects new £391 million bid by Sytner parent and Sweden's Hedin. So apologies, because I think at the beginning of the programme I said Lithia rather than Hedin with a counter bid. So this broke just within a day or so after the announcement that Lithia had put its deal on the table. So this is a joint deal from Lithia and Penske, and it's for £391 million, and it is being rejected. So again, interesting to see how this one plays out.
Yeah, as you say there, the unsolicited proposal by Hedin Mobility and Penske 2 days after they declared it, was selling it, Sevens Allshore and the Stratstone's dealership. You know what? Hedin Mobility Group made a similar offer, if you remember, last year, and that was for more than 400 million. That was, as I said earlier, it was subsequently withdrawn. Now, I don't know. They say the first deal looks complicated, but as you say, it offers a different proposition, doesn't it? With that Pinewood breakout remaining as a listed business, opportunities to move it immediately into the Jardine business, and to try and get that into the US using Lithia's footprint over in the US. So, the shareholders that are holding that with Pendragon might go, do you know what? Actually, I'll take my 16.5 for the Pendragon dealership sale, and I can see me opportunity in maintaining me 10, 11 pence in the Pinewood deal, and see the opportunity of growth on my shares and my investment in that side of the business instead, and take the dividend out of the other side. So I don't know. I mean, you just don't know who someone else might come in with. To offer to do the same thing as what Lithia have proposed. We know there are other international global businesses that are looking to buy, and they're looking at the UK as well as other markets. You might get Penske and Hedin might come back with a counter deal that may be similar to Lithia, and then the question is, can they then offer what Lithia are doing? Well, Penske certainly can't they, with their footprint over in the US and their footprint in the UK.
Yes.
I don't know. It's we don't know yet, do we?
We don't know, and we will be returning to this story. There's no doubt about that. But you know what? This deal, this deal that's been rejected, it does value the business at 28 pence a share. So big difference there between 28 and 16.5 pence per share, even allowing for the company effectively splitting in two under the Lithia deal. But so Hedin and Penske have until October the 18th to make a firm offer or stand down. So, as I say, we will be returning to this because there will be further updates.
So, final two stories on this one. You've got one in Car Dealer that says get out clause for Lithia in Pendragon deal is 30% of the car makers don't back deal. So this is about the conditions in small print reveal that Lithia wants backing from 70% of the car makers, the OEMs, and that car manufacturers must sign off on the sale of their dealerships to another party. Combined dealer group would have a large percentage of luxury car brands dealerships. Now, I don't know what your thoughts on this one. You wonder how much of this is playing into the space of agency and what that means and what Lithia are thinking around the transition to agency, etc. So that, I don't know, it's further complexity of this deal, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And, the OEMs do actually have a big say in what happens, and they will be looking at the counteroffers, I'm sure as well, which sort of takes us to the last story. So it's not often we cover 4 or 5 different headlines for one story, but this story really has moved on over the course of the week. So staying with Car Dealer, and the headline there is Neil Williamson to get top job leading Lithia's Pendragon and Jardine dealer group. So Neil Williamson, he'll be a familiar name to a lot of listeners because he was the boss of Jardine Motors for more than 8 years. And before that, and in fact, I first encountered him when he was managing director of SEAT. He ran SEAT in the UK for 2 years. And prior to that, he was the MD of Mercedes-Benz Retail Group. So quite a sort of unique grounding in both camps there as an OEM and a dealer group boss. And he's been named as heading up this new expanded business, providing everything goes through, of course.
So, subject to everything. Yeah. I mean, that's a top job, isn't it, that he can move straight into, because that would become, as you said right at the start of this story, that's a sizable size group then suddenly in the UK, and having the link into the US arm and other markets that Lithia obviously has. So a big opportunity there for Neil.
So Phil, as I say, we'll be returning to both of these stories probably next weekend. But next up is our resident well-being guru, Stephen Whitton, with his latest Menable moment, talking about life-affirming moments.
You're listening to All the Chatter That Matters on Motor Trade Radio, powered by eBay Motors Group. This is your weekly one-stop shop for all the biggest car retailing headlines from across the media, available on demand wherever you are on your podcast feed. Next up is our latest Menable moment, looking at mental health and well-being awareness, issues and best practices across the automotive sector, with me, Stephen Whitton. Yeah, hi guys, it's Menable Moments time again. Hope you're well. Can't believe we're rattling through September and we're nearly towards the end of it already. And this year really is whizzing past. So for this week's Menable Moments, I've got a little bit of an agenda. And that is, a few things I want to talk about. And that is life-affirming moments, about doing stuff that brings you joy. The dreaded month end, which is why I mentioned that we are rattling through September, because month end is just a week away. And independent car dealers. So, firstly, let me talk a little bit about life-affirming moments. 2 things have happened to me this week that have really made me think, wow, I know we're fragile and precious and there's, lots of things going on that really remind us every day of just how important life is and how important it is to support each other. But this week, I've had 2 things that have happened that have really brought that home. The first was that I got tickets to go and see a show in London on Monday night, and the show was called The Little Big Things, a New Musical. That's the full title of the show. It's about the story of a young man called Henry Fraser, who went on holiday with his brothers and decided to dive into the sea in Portugal. And unfortunately, the sea wasn't as deep as he anticipated. He broke his neck and he's ended up as a quadriplegic. Now, obviously, that's a very, very sad and very poignant story. And as you can imagine, it was a very emotional depiction of that story, all set to a musical as well, which was brilliantly done. So yes, I am blatantly giving it a plug and saying if you can get to London and you can get tickets, go and see that show. It's just awesome. But the point is, Henry Fraser, the real Henry Fraser, is actually now making his way as a mouth artist, and he just does the most stunning pictures, but obviously he paints them with his mouth. So the story was just life-affirming, and honestly, everyone came out of there and whilst dabbing their eyes, were actually talking, wow, isn't that just a reminder of just how important it is to live for today, live in the moment, and just also support all of us, support everyone around you, because you really genuinely do not know what's around that corner. The second thing this week that's given me joy, many of you will know that actually one of the things that I have done recently is that, for the last couple of years, is I've been a trustee of a cancer charity in Milton Keynes. I don't do a huge amount as a trustee, other than really kind of bit of behind the scenes stuff and turn up for trustees meetings and give them my opinion, which you won't find surprising. But anyway, the point is that I'm absolutely delighted and proud to be a part of this charity. It's called Al's Pals, and it was founded by Suzanne, who has founded it in her father's name, who died of cancer about 5-6 years ago. And his dying wish was that there should be a buddy system in the Milton Keynes area for people who are suffering with cancer. And she set that charity up. And last night we were at an award ceremony in Milton Keynes, and she drew silver in the Community Business Award. So we're all absolutely delighted about that, because the charity literally has only been going about 3 years and has obviously had to cope with lockdown in the middle of that as well. So there again, another thing that's brought me joy and another life-affirming moment. So it kind of brings me on to month end, because I don't know about you, but when I was working in dealerships, month end was the absolute bane of my life. And I used to say, rather tongue-in-cheek, but I did mean it, why does month end catch us out every bloody month? It's only a month since the last one. So why is it such a big deal? And it's come home to me a bit more this week, because we're actually running a session, a webinar next week on the 29th of September for anyone who's a mental health first aider in an automotive business. Now, those boys and girls are meant to be available and on standby, I guess, to deal with anyone who's having a little bit of a crisis or a wobble or needs someone to reach out to. And someone said to me earlier in the week, you're not going to get too many on this webinar because it's month end. And I did stop and think, wow, that's a great example of how we are putting business before people. Now, you may say, well, of course we are, but really? In this world, and given everything we've just talked about, and with rising issues around mental health, mental wealth, or the lack of, and people needing help and support, mental health first aiders cannot spend an hour on a seminar because it's month end. So I'm just going to leave that there. You can probably tell from my tone that if I go any further with that, I'm going to be a little bit judgmental, and I don't want to deliberately upset anyone. I just want to make the point, really, that there is a good example of where we're putting, we're not putting people before profit. And I just wanted to flag that up there, really. Now, you may have seen a video that I put out this week about our Wellbeing Winners program, because that is very much a program that is about actually looking at what are you as a business doing to recognise and work on well-being for the people in your business. And we've got an accreditation program for that will give you an accreditation, obviously, and afterwards give you an action plan that will help you go all those steps further. And I made that little video in an independent dealer, which took me right the way back to my roots. And I don't know why, but I always get a real tingly feeling when I walk into an independent, because that's, I guess, where I started. And it just makes me think, wow, this is great. Loads of used cars, and it's all exciting and so on. So I want to give a massive shout out to Umesh Samani for allowing me to film that in his showroom. And if you're an independent dealer, we would absolutely love to work with you on the Wellbeing Winners Programme. So hopefully that was a fairly tenuous link, but you get where I was going with that. So there you go, everyone. Just wanted to flag up a few things. Again, life-affirming moments this week, things that bring you joy. The bane of everyone's life, which is month end. Can we please at some point take a step back and think, what is the effect that's having on the people that we expect to deliver a month end? And why does it take it out of everyone when actually it was only a few weeks since the last one? And we do have 12 month ends in a year, so we shouldn't really catch us out. And the final one is a massive, massive shout out to everyone really, but especially this week, Umesh Samani. So thanks again, guys, and we will speak soon.
Well, many thanks, Steve. Another great Menable moment there. And if you want to get hold of Steve, then you can email him at stephen.whitton@menable.org. That's Stephen with a PH. Or you can find him on menable.org. So sounds as Steve's had a pretty busy week as well.
Week, I think everybody has, yeah. So I hope Ian Godbold is listening to us this morning.
Yes,
we had a bit of an X chat with him. Is it X now? I don't know how you refer to it.
Oh, yeah, it just sounds wrong. Every time you say X, it just sounds wrong, doesn't it?
We had an X chat with Ian Godbold this week on how we're going to cover this week's headlines, but hopefully we've managed to get a majority of the stuff in. As always, there's a lot of other things happening, a lot of good stuff happening in the sector, a lot of updates and everything else. So do head over to the trade media magazines that we always talk about, the Car Dealer, Motor Trader, AM Online, Auto Retail, all the others that we include or try and include on a weekly basis. There's lots of other headlines. It's not just Pendragon and 20, 30, 35, but it does feel like that this week. But hopefully we've covered everything this week, and we will let you get back onto your Saturday normal routine now, because that's it from me and you, isn't it, Curtis?
It is, yeah. And I'll just add to that, Phil, that all the trade media that you mentioned there have done an absolutely brilliant job this week with those two big stories, and some of the follow-ups you won't find anywhere else. You won't find it in the national press. So do head back to all the headlines that we've mentioned, and we'll include on our newsletter that goes out Monday morning. But that really is all for now. So many thanks for joining us on the Motor Trade Radio podcast. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
You've been listening to Motor Trade Radio Podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group. We'll be sharing all the links from this week's headlines on Monday morning. So to make sure you receive them, just subscribe to the free newsletter on our LinkedIn page. Just search Motor Trade Radio Podcast.